Mrs. Parker had been teaching high school for over 2 decades, and she thought she had seen it all. But nothing prepared her for the student who showed up in her class on the first day of the new school year. Jason Reed. His name was scribbled at the bottom of her roster, barely noticeable among the other students. But as she glanced over the list of names, she couldn't help but feel a small twinge of something she couldn't place. She had heard of him before. A new student, transferred from a different district, a place she knew little about. She didn't have high expectations. Jason Reed would likely be another one of those students, she thought, who'd get lost in the crowd and eventually fade into obscurity. He'd probably be quiet, introverted, and more likely to be overlooked than noticed. Mrs. Parker looked at the class and sighed, scanning the room with her usual practiced eyes. She was a teacher who prided herself on knowing her students, seeing them for who they were before they even knew it themselves. Her goal was always to give them a chance, but in the back of her mind, she always held on to the reality that not everyone was going to excel. Not everyone had the chance to break free of their circumstances. It was the cold truth of the system. Then, the bell rang. Jason walked in a few minutes late, his presence barely making a sound as he slipped into the classroom. Mrs. Parker barely noticed him at first. He was just another kid, another face in the crowd. His uniform was a little too big, his backpack slightly worn, and his shoes showed signs of wear. Nothing unusual. He didn't have that air of someone with potential or drive that often caught her attention. In fact, it seemed as though he would slip into anonymity just like so many others. Mrs. Parker simply nodded toward the desk in the back. "Take a seat, Jason," she said, her voice warm but professional. Jason nodded without a word, his gaze downcast. His posture was slightly slumped as he made his way to the back. He wasn't disruptive or cocky, just quietly moved through the room. A typical first day for someone trying to blend in, hoping not to stand out too much. As the class settled, Mrs. Parker began her usual routine, introducing the syllabus, the class rules, and her expectations. But as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about Jason was different, even if she couldn't yet put her finger on it. "All right," she said, wrapping up her introduction. "We'll start with a basic review of algebra, and I expect each of you to participate. I know some of you might be ahead of the rest, and some of you may need extra help. But don't worry, we'll get there together." Mrs. Parker had long since stopped giving full attention to her students' test scores or their previous records. She preferred to see how they performed in her classroom. Anyone could have a bad year or slip through the cracks, but in her class, she wanted everyone to feel like they had a fresh start. With a confident smile, she posed a question to the class. "All right, everyone," she said, "solve this equation for x, 5x plus 3 is equal to 23. The students all took out their notebooks, a few of them scribbling eagerly, others slowly starting to work through the problem, while some, like Jason, remained silent, his pen hovering above the page, as if unsure how to start. Mrs. Parker turned her attention to him. "Jason?" Jason slowly looked up, his eyes distant for a moment before they focused on the board. He scanned the equation carefully, his brow furrowing slightly as if he was already seeing something Mrs. Parker hadn't expected. After a pause, he raised his hand. "Yes, Jason?" Mrs. Parker asked, trying to mask her surprise. Most of the students would have been stumped by such a simple question, especially the quiet ones who tended to avoid drawing attention to themselves. "You can simplify it by subtracting 3 from both sides," Jason began, his voice soft but steady, "then you get 5x equals 20. After that, divide both sides by 5, and x equals 4. Mrs. Parker blinked in surprise. She had expected the typical answer, a few confused faces, someone asking for help, maybe a wrong answer here or there. But Jason had answered the problem without hesitation, and his explanation was clear and concise. Too concise. She glanced at the other students. They were still working through the problem, some already getting stuck. "That's correct," she said, her voice a little more careful now. She wasn't sure what to make of this. This quiet kid in the back had just answered a question that no one else had managed to solve yet. Mrs. Parker tried to brush it off, but there was a lingering curiosity in the back of her mind. "All right, moving on," she continued, but the rest of the class no longer had her full attention. Her eyes were drawn to Jason, who sat there, looking almost uninterested now that he had solved the problem. He wasn't smug about it, didn't seem to care that he had answered correctly. Something didn't add up. As the class continued, Mrs. Parker couldn't help but wonder if she had underestimated him already. After all, the quiet ones were usually the ones who surprised you. Maybe Jason Reed wasn't like the rest. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment to reveal it. After class ended, Mrs. Parker lingered at her desk, scanning through the class list again. Her mind raced with questions. Why had Jason answered so quickly? Was he just naturally good at math? Or was there something more to him, something she hadn't yet seen? Then she saw it. The notes. The thin, spiral-bound notebook Jason had placed on his desk. Mrs. Parker felt a strange pull to it, her fingers itching to open it, to see what was written. She fought the impulse, reminding herself that she needed to remain professional. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was something important here. Something Jason was hiding. With a quiet sigh, Mrs. Parker packed up her things and made her way to the door. As she passed by Jason, who was gathering his things, she offered a simple, friendly smile. "You did well today," she said. "See you tomorrow, Jason." Jason didn't look up from his bag. He simply nodded. But Mrs. Parker could tell, even in that brief moment, that there was more to him than met the eye. And for the first time that day, she felt a spark of curiosity. "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," she almost said aloud to herself, as if imagining the story unfolding in front of an audience. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? She couldn't shake the feeling that Jason Reed was going to be a student who would test everything she thought she knew about her job, and herself. The following day, Mrs. Parker entered the classroom with a lingering sense of curiosity about Jason Reed. His brief moment of brilliance the day before had stayed with her more than she cared to admit. Despite her years of experience, she had always prided herself on being able to gauge her students fairly quickly. But Jason? He had thrown her off balance. As the students filed in, Mrs. Parker's eyes quickly found him in the back of the room. He was sitting in the same spot, staring at the front of the room with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't the usual disinterest she saw in other students, it was something else, something more intense. Maybe it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Jason had something important on his mind. She began the class with her usual routine, explaining the lesson plan for the day. Today they would cover basic algebraic principles again, but she would introduce a more complex topic to see how the class responded. She wanted to test the waters, to gauge who was ready for the next challenge. "All right, class," she began, her voice clear but measured, "today we're going to explore quadratic equations. I know some of you may have seen these before, but I'll be giving you a bit more depth than you might expect." The room was quiet as she wrote out an equation on the board, x superscript 2 plus bx plus c equals 0. Most of the students looked at it with confusion, a few whispering to each other as they tried to make sense of it. Mrs. Parker gave them a few moments before speaking again. "Does anyone know what this is called?" she asked. The room remained silent for a few seconds, until Jason's voice broke through. "It's a quadratic equation," he said, sounding calm, almost indifferent. Mrs. Parker paused. She hadn't expected him to answer, and she certainly hadn't expected him to get it right, especially not so easily. "That's correct," she said, her voice a little more guarded now. "But can you tell me how you would solve it?" Jason didn't hesitate. He looked at the equation for a second, then said, "You can solve it by factoring, or you can use the quadratic formula, where x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Mrs. Parker's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. The way he said it was effortless, as if he had been solving these types of equations for years. She was used to students fumbling through simple problems, struggling to get the steps right. But Jason? He made it sound like it was second nature. The class was equally stunned. A few students exchanged looks, clearly impressed, while others shifted in their seats, unsure how to react. Mrs. Parker felt a sense of unease creeping over her. Jason's knowledge was not just advanced, it was far beyond what she had expected from a student in this class, especially one who had been so quiet, so reserved, on the first day. She quickly recovered from her surprise and continued with the lesson. "Very good, Jason. I appreciate you answering that. But let's move on and make sure everyone understands it. This is something we'll build on in future lessons." Jason simply nodded, but Mrs. Parker could see that he wasn't truly engaged with the rest of the class. He wasn't a show-off or someone trying to prove something. He was just different. There was no excitement in his voice, no desire for attention, just a quiet certainty that unnerved her. As the lesson continued, Mrs. Parker tried to redirect the attention to the rest of the class. She asked a few of the other students to try solving equations on the board. Most of them stumbled, trying to recall the steps, but Jason sat back in his chair, looking out the window, as though he were already miles away from the room. She couldn't stop herself from stealing glances at him throughout the lesson. There was something about his presence, an understated confidence, yet a distinct distance from the rest of the class. Jason didn't try to fit in, he didn't seek approval. But it was clear that his intellect separated him from the others. The bell rang, and the students packed up their things, preparing to leave. Jason stood up slowly, as if in no hurry to exit. Mrs. Parker felt an odd compulsion to speak to him again. "Jason, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked as the other students filtered out of the room. He paused, looking at her with that same unreadable expression. After a beat, he nodded and walked over to her desk. "Yes, Mrs. Parker." His voice was soft, but there was an undeniable edge to it, almost as if he were cautious, like he had been expecting this moment. "I just wanted to ask," she trailed off, unsure how to phrase her next words. "You're very good with mathematics. It's not common for students to grasp concepts like this so quickly. Have you studied this before?" Jason shook his head slightly. "Not really," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. I learn fast. It's always been like that." Mrs. Parker studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his voice, no hint of boasting. He was simply stating a fact that, for him, seemed normal. It made her wonder how many students like Jason had slipped under the radar, students who were underestimated because of their quiet demeanor or their background. "Well, you seem to have a natural talent for it," she said, offering a warm smile. "If you ever need any extra challenges or want to explore more advanced topics, let me know. I think you could do really well if you push yourself." Jason's eyes flickered for a moment, a hint of something, maybe gratitude, maybe caution, passing through them. "Thanks," he said quietly, before turning to leave. As he walked out the door, Mrs. Parker stood there for a moment, watching him. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jason Reed wasn't like the others. There was something hidden in him, something he wasn't showing. But what was it? And why hadn't anyone noticed it before? She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside for the moment. There would be plenty of time to figure it out. For now, she had a classroom full of students to manage, and they all needed her attention. But deep down, Mrs. Parker knew that Jason's presence was going to be a game-changer. And for the first time in a long while, she was eager to see where it would lead. As the weeks went on, Jason continued to surprise Mrs. Parker. It wasn't just his natural ability with math that stood out, but his quiet presence in class, his subtle but perceptive comments, and the way he seemed to understand complex concepts before anyone else. Jason never sought attention. He rarely volunteered answers unless called upon, but when he did, his responses were often right on point, insightful, and mature beyond his years. It was during the second week of class when Mrs. Parker first realized that Jason wasn't just a brilliant student, he was something more. The lesson for the day was about systems of equations, a topic that most of the class struggled with. As Mrs. Parker wrote the first problem on the board, she saw several students scribbling down notes with furrowed brows. Some had already begun to ask for help, while others simply sat back, feeling overwhelmed. Jason, as usual, was quiet, looking at the board with a steady gaze. Mrs. Parker noticed that he wasn't scribbling away like the others. Instead, he was carefully considering the equations, his mind clearly working through the problem in his head. "All right, class," she began, "I'll walk you through solving this system of linear equations. First, you want to isolate one variable." She paused, waiting for the usual chorus of confused murmurs, but Jason's hand shot up instead. Mrs. Parker turned toward him, a bit surprised. "Yes, Jason?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Jason's voice was soft but clear as he spoke. "I think I've found a quicker way to solve it." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. The students who were listening seemed to shift in their seats, all eyes turning toward him. Mrs. Parker was unsure of how to respond. In her experience, students didn't just jump ahead like this unless they were either show-offs or had been studying the material outside of class. "Go ahead," she said cautiously. Jason didn't waste time. He stood up from his desk and walked up to the board. He picked up the marker and began writing down the equations, but instead of following the usual method, he began manipulating the system in a way that made the process seem almost effortless. "There's a way to use substitution here, but we can also use elimination to get straight to the solution. If we multiply the second equation by 2, we'll get the same coefficient for the y variable. This way, we can add the equations directly to eliminate y and solve for x," he explained, his voice calm and composed. Mrs. Parker stood there, watching as Jason worked through the problem in front of the class. The other students were silent, unsure what to make of it. Jason finished quickly, writing down the solution before stepping aside. "The answer is x equals 3 and y equals -1, he said, stepping back from the board. Mrs. Parker was stunned. Jason had just solved the problem in half the time it would have taken her to explain it. And he had done it in a way that was so efficient, so methodical, it left her momentarily speechless. For a moment, the classroom was still. Then, a few students began to murmur, some of them glancing at each other in disbelief. Mrs. Parker didn't know how to respond. Was this normal for Jason? She'd known that he was sharp, but this was beyond impressive. It was as if he had been studying higher-level math for years, and yet here he was, sitting in her standard Algebra 2 class. "Very impressive, Jason," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "You've just made that problem look so much easier than it really is." Jason shrugged, his eyes briefly meeting hers before he looked away. "It's just how I think about it," he replied quietly, returning to his seat. There was no boastfulness in his tone, no pride in his actions, just a simple, almost unassuming confidence. Mrs. Parker couldn't help but feel a little unsettled. This level of intelligence wasn't typical for a student in her class, especially not one who had only recently transferred from a different school. And yet, Jason had barely revealed any of his true potential up until now. He was an enigma, and it made her feel like there was something more to him that she still didn't understand. Later that day, as Mrs. Parker was grading papers in her classroom, she couldn't shake the thoughts that had been racing through her mind all day. Jason was clearly gifted in a way that far surpassed most of the students she had taught over the years. But the question remained, why wasn't he in a higher-level class? Why was someone with such intelligence sitting in a room full of students who could barely keep up? As she graded papers, Mrs. Parker couldn't help but notice that Jason's notebook, which he had left behind on the desk earlier that day, was still on the corner of her desk. She hesitated for a moment. Was it right to look? It felt invasive, but at the same time, she was desperate to understand him. She wanted to know more about this quiet, reserved student who had the potential to change the course of his life, and maybe even the world around him. With a deep breath, she opened the notebook. What she saw made her heart race. The pages weren't filled with just math problems and solutions. They were filled with complex formulas, mathematical theories, and even equations that went well beyond the scope of anything Mrs. Parker had ever taught. Some of them were familiar, but most were not. There were references to theories in physics and advanced calculus, and even a few pages that looked like they were written in a cryptic code she couldn't understand. Jason wasn't just good at math, he was a prodigy. But why wasn't he in an advanced class? Why had no one noticed his brilliance before? Mrs. Parker's mind raced as she closed the notebook, feeling a wave of concern wash over her. She couldn't just ignore what she had discovered. Jason was clearly hiding something, perhaps even from himself. He wasn't using his full potential, and Mrs. Parker couldn't help but wonder why. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day. Mrs. Parker quickly returned the notebook to Jason's desk before any of the other students saw. As Jason walked out of the classroom, Mrs. Parker made up her mind. She would need to talk to him. She couldn't let someone with so much untapped potential slip through the cracks, not without at least trying to understand him better. The days following Jason's revelation in class were filled with a quiet tension that Mrs. Parker couldn't shake. She had always been a good teacher, always thought she had a strong connection with her students, but Jason was different. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she was starting to worry for him. There was something unsettling about how little he shared about himself, despite his brilliance. He was a mystery, and like all mysteries, she felt a need to uncover the truth. That afternoon, as she made her way to the teacher's lounge for a quick break, she overheard a conversation between two of her colleagues. "Did you hear about the Reed kid?" Mrs. Harris, a history teacher, said, her voice carrying clearly through the hallway. "Jason Reed? Yeah, he's a quiet one, isn't he?" Mr. Bennett, the physics teacher, replied. Mrs. Parker paused just outside the lounge door, not wanting to interrupt but too curious to leave. "Well, he's smart," Mrs. Harris continued, "but there's something off about him. Have you noticed how he never really talks to anyone? Not like the other kids. He's always by himself. He's been at this school for almost a month now, and no one really knows anything about him. It's like he's keeping something hidden." Mrs. Parker felt a chill at Mrs. Harris's words. It wasn't just her, other teachers were noticing Jason's distance as well. She'd known from the start that Jason was a quiet kid, but now she wondered if there was more to it. "Yeah, I've heard rumors," Mr. Bennett muttered. "There's something about his family, too. Word is, he came here from another district, but I don't think he's really from around here. They say his mom's going through some things. I don't know." Mrs. Harris lowered her voice, as if concerned that anyone else might overhear. "I heard he used to live in a rough neighborhood before they moved here. I don't know the details, but it sounds like his life hasn't exactly been easy. And with the way he keeps to himself. I wonder if that's affecting his performance in class." Mrs. Parker stood frozen in place, her heart sinking. She knew that Jason's quiet nature wasn't just about being shy or introverted. There was a deeper struggle that he wasn't letting anyone see, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next class. Mrs. Parker pushed open the lounge door, her mind racing with thoughts of Jason. She needed to find a way to talk to him, to understand what he was going through. But how could she help someone who seemed determined to keep everyone at arm's length? The next morning, Mrs. Parker walked into her classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't going to let Jason slip through the cracks, not without at least trying to reach him. She had been a teacher long enough to know that every student had a story, but Jason's story felt different. It felt like he was carrying a heavy burden, one that was keeping him from fully embracing his potential. As the students trickled into the classroom, Mrs. Parker glanced over at Jason, who was already sitting in his usual spot at the back. He didn't acknowledge her, but then again, he never did. He seemed focused on something, staring at the desk in front of him with an almost vacant expression. Mrs. Parker took a deep breath and walked over to him. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, unsure how to approach him. "Jason, do you have a moment after class?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Jason looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers for a brief second. Then, he nodded slowly. "Sure," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. After the lesson ended, as the other students filed out of the classroom, Mrs. Parker walked over to Jason's desk. He remained seated, his hands folded neatly on top of the desk, his posture stiff and guarded. "Jason," she began, her voice soft but direct, "I wanted to talk to you about something. You've been doing incredibly well in class. I've noticed that you have a real gift for math, but I also sense that something's going on with you. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I just want you to know that I'm here if you need someone to talk to." Jason didn't immediately respond. He stared at the desk, his fingers fidgeting with a pen. Mrs. Parker waited patiently, giving him space to speak. After a long pause, Jason finally looked up at her, his expression still guarded. "I'm fine," he said quietly. I just don't like to make a big deal out of things." Mrs. Parker nodded. She could hear the underlying sadness in his voice, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she tried to offer a different kind of support. "I understand," she said. "But Jason, you don't have to go through things alone. If there's ever anything you need, whether it's help with school or just someone to talk to, I'm here for you. You don't have to keep everything bottled up inside." Jason's eyes flickered with something, maybe surprise, maybe uncertainty. For a brief moment, Mrs. Parker thought he might say something more. But instead, he simply nodded again. "Thanks, Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice even softer than before. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, Jason stood up, grabbed his things, and walked out of the classroom without another word. Mrs. Parker watched him go, her heart heavy with concern. She knew that she hadn't gotten through to him completely. But at least she had offered him an opening, a door that he could walk through whenever he was ready. As she sat down at her desk, Mrs. Parker couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard in the teacher's lounge. Jason's mother, his past, the struggles he had faced, everything about him seemed to be shrouded in mystery. He had a brilliant mind, but it was clear that he was fighting battles that no one else could see. Mrs. Parker knew that Jason's journey wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew that she couldn't give up on him. There was a fire inside of him, a spark that needed to be nurtured, even if it meant patiently waiting for him to open up. Weeks passed, and Jason continued to keep his distance, even though Mrs. Parker made a concerted effort to reach out to him. He would occasionally look her way in class, but he never initiated a conversation, never sought her help beyond the necessary. Still, she watched him closely, sensing that there was more to him than he was letting on. Despite his quiet demeanor, his performance in class was impeccable. His ability to solve complex problems and understand difficult concepts astounded Mrs. Parker, who had never encountered a student quite like him. It wasn't just his intelligence, there was something else. A hunger, a drive, hidden beneath the surface. One Friday afternoon, during lunch, Mrs. Parker was walking through the hallway when she noticed Jason sitting alone in the far corner of the cafeteria. It was the same spot where she'd seen him every day, away from the other students. His lunch tray was untouched in front of him, his gaze lost in the space in front of him. She hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. She wasn't sure if he would appreciate the gesture, but something inside told her it was the right time to make an effort to reach out once again. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jason didn't look up immediately, but after a few seconds, he nodded. Sure. Mrs. Parker took a seat across from him, offering him a small smile. Jason didn't return the smile, but he didn't seem uncomfortable either. He simply continued to stare at his tray, not saying a word. Jason, Mrs. Parker began softly, I've been thinking about something. You've been doing incredibly well in class, better than anyone I've ever taught at your level. But I sense you're carrying something heavy with you. I just want you to know, you don't have to do this alone. Jason remained silent, but the slight shift in his posture told her he was listening. Everyone goes through tough times, Jason, she continued. And sometimes, the best way to get through them is by letting others in. You don't have to share everything, but if there's something you want to talk about, I'm here for you. Jason finally looked up at her, his dark eyes intense but guarded. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Mrs. Parker waited patiently, giving him the space he needed. I don't know how to explain it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's just, I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. Mrs. Parker's heart went out to him. She could sense the pain behind his words, the reluctance to let anyone in because he feared judgment or pity. She understood that fear well. She had seen it in other students, but with Jason, it felt different, like he was trying to protect something far more fragile. I'm not here to pity you, Jason, she said softly. I'm here to help, if you want it. You're not alone in this. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. Jason was quiet for a long time, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his tray. Mrs. Parker waited, giving him the time he needed to process her words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I'm not like everyone else, he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. My mom's sick, and it's hard. It's hard to be in school and pretend everything's fine when it's not. But I don't want anyone to think I'm using it as an excuse. I don't want anyone to look at me differently. Mrs. Parker's heart ached for him. She could feel the weight of his words, the burden he had been carrying in silence. But she also knew that his strength wasn't just in his ability to hide his struggles, it was in the fact that he had been pushing through them, even when everything seemed like it was falling apart. Jason, she said, her voice steady but full of compassion, it's okay to not be okay. You don't have to pretend. We all face struggles in life. The important thing is that you don't face them alone. And when you're ready, I'll be here for you, not just as a teacher, but as someone who cares. Jason didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, staring down at his tray, lost in thought. Mrs. Parker gave him a few moments of silence, not wanting to press him further. Slowly, though, she saw a small shift in his demeanor. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, and the way he held himself, rigid and withdrawn, softened just slightly. Finally, after a long silence, Jason looked up at her. His eyes, still guarded, seemed to hold a hint of something more, something she couldn't quite place. I'll think about it, he said quietly. Mrs. Parker smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. That's all I ask, she replied. As she got up to leave, she felt a small but significant shift in their relationship. She didn't know what the future held for Jason, but she knew that he was no longer a mystery to her. He was a young man struggling with pain, but he was also a young man with incredible potential. And now, he knew that there was someone in his corner who would stand by him, no matter what. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Jason's behavior didn't change dramatically, but Mrs. Parker noticed subtle differences. He seemed a bit less withdrawn, a bit more open in class discussions. He still kept to himself at lunch, but every so often, Mrs. Parker would catch him glancing her way, as if considering something. And then, one day, after class, Jason approached her desk. I've been thinking, he began, his voice steady but still quiet. Maybe I could try doing more advanced math. I don't think I'm really being challenged here. Mrs. Parker felt a rush of pride and relief. Jason was taking the first step toward embracing his full potential, and it was clear that he was beginning to trust her. "That's exactly what I've been thinking," she said, smiling warmly at him. "I think you're ready for it, Jason. Let's talk to the principal about moving you up." Jason nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thanks, Mrs. Parker," he said quietly. Mrs. Parker watched him leave, her heart swelling with hope. Jason was no longer the quiet, withdrawn student he had once been. He was beginning to believe in himself, and that was the first step toward the future he deserved. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Jason. He was moved to an advanced math class, a decision that filled him with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He had always been exceptional with numbers, but the idea of being surrounded by students who were all far ahead of him made him nervous. Still, Mrs. Parker believed in him, and that belief gave him the courage to push forward, even when his insecurities threatened to pull him back. Jason sat in his new seat at the front of the class, surrounded by a group of students who were well established in their academic prowess. The math problems on the whiteboard seemed like an alien language at first, symbols and numbers dancing on the screen, far beyond anything he had encountered before. He felt a familiar pang of self-doubt gnawing at him, but he swallowed it down. He had done this before. He had been underestimated before. And he would prove them all wrong again. Mrs. Parker entered the classroom, her eyes scanning the room until they settled on Jason. A knowing smile tugged at her lips. She could tell he was struggling, but she also knew he had the ability to rise to the challenge. Jason's potential was limitless, and if anyone could help him realize it, it was her. "Good morning, everyone." Mrs. Parker greeted the class with a warm smile. "Today we're diving into calculus, so I want to make sure you're all prepared to tackle some complex problems. Jason, welcome to the advanced group. I'm excited to see how you do." Jason's heart raced at her words. He wasn't sure if he should feel proud or terrified. He glanced around, wondering if anyone else was noticing that he was new to this level. But when he met the gaze of one of his classmates, a girl named Sarah, she gave him an encouraging nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel a little less out of place. As the lesson began, Mrs. Parker started explaining the basic principles of calculus. Jason's mind immediately started processing the concepts, something inside him shifting as the problems began to make sense. The equations on the board were no longer intimidating, they were simply puzzles waiting to be solved. His fingers danced over the paper as he solved the problems in front of him with ease. But despite his ease with the material, something in the back of his mind nagged at him. His success in the class felt hollow, like he was still hiding behind a mask. He could solve equations, he could impress his teachers, but what good was any of it if no one knew the real him? As the bell rang and the class started to filter out, Mrs. Parker walked up to Jason's desk. "Good work today, Jason," she said, her voice warm with approval. "I saw you breeze through those problems like they were second nature." Jason looked up, his eyes a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "Thanks, Mrs. Parker. But it's not that hard. I've always been good at math." She nodded, understanding the self-deprecation in his tone. "I know you're good at math. But it's not just about being good at something. It's about trusting yourself enough to go for it, to believe in your own potential. You're more than just your grades, Jason." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so much of his life hiding behind his abilities, focusing on his intellect as a way to avoid having to face the things he didn't want to confront. But Mrs. Parker was right, he was more than just the sum of his test scores. And for the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him, not just his intelligence, but his heart. I think I understand," Jason said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Mrs. Parker smiled, proud of how far he had come. "Good. Remember, you don't have to do this alone. You've got people in your corner. As Jason packed his things and left the classroom, he couldn't help but think about her words. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. Over the next few weeks, Jason continued to excel in his new class. His confidence began to grow, but so did his awareness of just how much he had been holding back. It wasn't just his academic abilities that were starting to shine, it was his inner strength, his resilience. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel proud of who he was. But even with his newfound success, there were still moments of doubt. One evening, as Jason sat at his desk doing homework, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw a text message from his mom. "Jason, we need to talk." A wave of unease washed over him. He quickly typed a response. "What's wrong?" The message took a few minutes to appear. When it finally did, Jason's heart skipped a beat. "I don't think I can keep going like this. I don't want to be a burden anymore." Jason stared at the message, his breath catching in his throat. He had known that his mom was struggling, he could see it in the way she moved slower these days, in the way she spoke less often, but he had never imagined it had gotten to this point. The thought that she might be giving up on herself made him feel sick to his stomach. He quickly called her, his fingers trembling as he pressed the phone to his ear. After a few moments, she picked up. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking. "What do you mean you can't keep going? What's going on?" His mother's voice was faint, worn. "Jason, I just don't know how much more I can take. I don't want you to see me like this. You're doing so well in school, and I don't want to be the one holding you back. I think I might need to go away for a while. Get some help." Jason's heart twisted in his chest. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they would get through this together. But in that moment, he realized just how much weight she had been carrying, and how much he had been carrying too. "Mom," Jason said, his voice firm now, "I'm here for you. We're in this together. You're not a burden. You're my mom. And we'll figure it out, okay?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, she sighed, a sound that felt like both relief and exhaustion. "Okay, Jason," she whispered. "Okay." The next day at school, Jason arrived early, his mind racing with everything that had happened the night before. He had never felt more determined. He knew his mother's struggles weren't over, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had a purpose now, not just for himself, but for her too. Mrs. Parker noticed the change in him. She could see the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way he walked a little taller and held his head a little higher. He was still quiet, still reserved, but there was a confidence in him now that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Jason," she greeted him with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker," Jason replied, his voice steady. He met her gaze and for the first time, she saw not just the smart student, but a young man who had found something to fight for. "Keep it up," Mrs. Parker said, her eyes full of pride. "I will," Jason said quietly, his voice filled with quiet determination. Jason had always been underestimated. But now, he knew that his true potential wasn't just in his mind, it was in his heart. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. The weeks after Jason's conversation with his mother felt like a delicate balancing act. While his success in school continued to shine, there was a heaviness in his heart. Every day, he saw the toll his mother's illness was taking on her, and every day, he felt the weight of the responsibilities he had taken on himself. The pressure was mounting, and there were moments when he felt as if he was carrying the world on his shoulders. But, Jason had made a promise to himself, and to his mom, that he wouldn't let it break him. He pushed through his classes with determination, finding solace in the challenges that came with them. The numbers on the whiteboard, the calculus problems, the equations, they were his refuge. They were predictable, stable, unlike everything else in his life. But even with his academic achievements, Jason found it harder to connect with the other students. He had always kept to himself, but now, it felt even more difficult. The more he immersed himself in his studies, the more he felt like an outsider. His classmates didn't understand the weight he was carrying, and though Mrs. Parker had shown him kindness, there were still moments when Jason wished he didn't have to explain himself to anyone. It felt easier to just keep going, to stay quiet and hidden in the safety of his intellect. It was during one of these moments, when Jason was lost in his thoughts as he walked out of his advanced math class, that Sarah, the girl who had given him the small nod of encouragement earlier in the semester, stopped him in the hallway. "Hey, Jason," she said, her voice warm and friendly. "How's the new class going?" Jason hesitated. He hadn't expected anyone to approach him. Sarah was one of the more popular kids in school, and though they had shared a few glances and nods in class, they hadn't really spoken much outside of it. "It's good," Jason replied, forcing a small smile. "Challenging, but good." "Yeah, I can imagine." Sarah gave him a sympathetic smile. "I've seen you working through the problems in class. You're really good at this stuff, aren't you?" Jason shrugged, trying to remain nonchalant. "It's just math." Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowed as if she could sense there was more to his words than he was letting on. "You know," she said after a moment, "if you ever want to talk, I'm here. You don't have to do all of this alone, you know." Jason looked up at her, caught off guard by her sincerity. There was a kindness in her eyes that made his chest tighten. He had spent so long building walls around himself, afraid of what might happen if he let someone in. But here was Sarah, offering him something he wasn't sure he even knew how to accept: friendship. "I'm fine," Jason said quickly, then regretted it as soon as the words left his mouth. It sounded too dismissive, too cold. But Sarah didn't take offense. She simply smiled and nodded. "All right. Just know I'm here if you need anything." Jason didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, the weight of his thoughts pressing in on him again. What was he supposed to do with kindness like that? He wasn't sure, but something inside him felt lighter, even if just for a moment. As the semester continued, Jason found himself grappling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, his schoolwork was going better than ever. He aced his advanced math tests, even began tutoring other students who were struggling. Mrs. Parker's encouragement made him feel like he was finally tapping into his full potential. But on the other hand, there was a quiet storm brewing in his life. His mother's condition was worsening, and he had no idea how much longer he could keep pretending everything was fine. One night, after finishing his homework, Jason sat in the living room, watching his mom slowly shuffle around the house. She looked even more fragile now, thinner, her movements slower. Jason hated seeing her like this. He hated feeling helpless, knowing that there was nothing he could do to fix it. But he didn't know how to talk to her about it. Just as he was lost in thought, his mom sat down beside him on the couch, her eyes tired but soft. "Jason," she said quietly, "I know you've been trying so hard lately. I know you're doing your best." Jason didn't say anything. He just looked at her, not sure what to say. "I'm proud of you," she continued, her voice filled with love. "But you don't have to carry everything on your own, you know. You can talk to me. I'm still your mom, even if I'm not always the mom I want to be right now." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. He had been trying so hard to be strong for her, but he hadn't realized just how much he had been carrying on his own. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let someone else help him. "I don't want to let you down," Jason said softly. "I don't want to let anyone down." His mother placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You won't. You're already doing so much, Jason. Just remember, you don't have to do everything by yourself. We'll figure it out, together." That was the moment that Jason finally allowed himself to lean into the support that had always been available to him. For so long, he had been afraid to accept help, convinced that he had to handle everything alone. But now, he realized that there was strength in vulnerability, in letting others see the real him. At school the next day, Jason felt different. There was a quiet confidence in his step that hadn't been there before. When he walked into Mrs. Parker's class, he could feel the weight of his mother's words still echoing in his mind. "You don't have to do everything by yourself." Mrs. Parker greeted him with her usual smile. "Good morning, Jason. Ready to dive into today's lesson?" Jason nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, I'm ready." As the lesson began, Jason felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just the quiet student trying to stay under the radar. He wasn't just the smart kid everyone underestimated. He was Jason, a young man with a story, a young man who was finally starting to embrace his full potential, not just academically, but emotionally. For the first time in a long while, Jason allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future where he wasn't burdened by his struggles, but defined by his ability to overcome them. After class, Sarah caught up with him again, her smile warm and easy. "You're doing great," she said. "I've noticed you've been more engaged in class. It's awesome to see you doing so well." Jason couldn't help but smile, his heart a little lighter than before. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." As the two of them walked down the hallway together, Jason realized something important. He wasn't alone anymore, not in school, not at home. He had a future, and for the first time, he was starting to believe in it. Jason felt a subtle shift in his perspective as he moved through the next few weeks. The weight of his responsibilities at home hadn't lightened, but somehow, it felt more manageable. He was finding a rhythm between his schoolwork and his role as caretaker, his inner strength growing with every day. Still, there were moments when the exhaustion from everything seemed too much, but in those moments, he would think of his mom's words, "We'll figure it out, together." Mrs. Parker noticed a difference in him too. Not just his academic performance, but the way he carried himself. His eyes, once full of uncertainty, now had a quiet confidence that could not be ignored. It wasn't just the fact that he was acing his tests, though that was certainly impressive, it was the way he was starting to connect with the material and with the people around him. It was clear that Jason wasn't just working harder, he was working smarter, balancing both his mind and his heart. One afternoon, after class, Mrs. Parker asked Jason to stay behind. As the classroom emptied, the usual hum of voices died down, and Jason stood by her desk, his hands fiddling with the strap of his backpack. "Jason," Mrs. Parker said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of seriousness. "I've been watching you for a while now. And I've noticed a change. It's like you've come alive in ways that you hadn't before. You're excelling in class, yes, but it's more than that. You're not just hiding behind your intelligence anymore. You're stepping into your own, and that's something I want to support." Jason blinked, feeling the weight of her words. For the longest time, he had hidden behind his intellect because it was safe, because it was all he could control. But now, as his world expanded beyond just equations and grades, he found himself standing on the edge of something far more important, his own personal growth. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker," Jason said softly. "I'm trying. But, it's not always easy. My mom's not doing well, and I feel like I'm holding everything together for her." Mrs. Parker's expression softened. "I understand," she said quietly. "But you don't have to hold it all together alone. You don't have to be the hero of this story, Jason. It's okay to ask for help. You have people who care about you. And I can see that you're growing in ways that go beyond just being the smartest student in the room." Jason swallowed hard. It was difficult to accept help, to admit that he couldn't do everything himself. But hearing Mrs. Parker say those words made him realize that maybe it was time to stop trying to do it all alone. "I guess I just don't want to let her down," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Parker gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You're not letting anyone down by being human. By taking care of yourself, you're actually giving yourself the strength to be there for your mom in ways you never could before." Jason nodded, absorbing her words. He was learning more than just math in her class. He was learning about life, about vulnerability, and about finding the balance between caring for others and caring for himself. The following days felt like a turning point for Jason. He started to open up more to Sarah, who had consistently offered her friendship without pressure. They began to study together after school, and through those sessions, Jason learned that having someone to talk to could be as valuable as solving any equation. It was during one of their study sessions that Sarah said something that stuck with him. "Jason," she said, looking up from her notebook. "You know, you're really good at this. But I think you could do even more with your life. Like, way more than just being the quiet kid in class who aces the tests." Jason looked up at her, a little surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sarah continued, "you're not just good at math. You're good at seeing the world differently. You have a way of looking at problems that others don't. You should think about going somewhere with that. You've got a gift, Jason." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time, Jason allowed himself to entertain the possibility that Sarah was right. He wasn't just meant to be the kid in the back of the class, solving problems in isolation. Maybe he could go further, push his limits in ways that he hadn't yet imagined. Maybe he could use his gift for more than just passing tests. That night, after Sarah left, Jason sat on his bed and stared at his open textbook, but his mind wasn't on the calculus problems. Instead, he thought about what Sarah had said. "You have a gift." It was something he had always known deep down, but he had never truly considered what he could do with it. He thought about the future, his future, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the spark of possibility. The next day at school, Mrs. Parker introduced a new challenge for her advanced math students, a national math competition. It was a prestigious event, and for the first time, Jason felt the surge of excitement that came with the thought of testing his abilities in a real-world setting. This wasn't just about a test in class anymore, it was about competing on a larger stage, about proving to the world, and to himself, that he could go beyond what anyone had ever expected of him. "You've got this, Jason," Mrs. Parker said after class, noticing the quiet intensity in his eyes. "You've been ready for something like this. But remember, it's not just about the competition. It's about pushing yourself and seeing how far you can go." Jason nodded, feeling his pulse quicken. He had always loved a challenge, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a test of his abilities, it was a test of his own belief in himself. Could he really step out of the shadows and show the world what he was capable of? As Jason prepared for the competition, he found himself more motivated than ever. He studied late into the night, reviewing formulas, solving complex problems, and refining his skills. Each equation felt like a step closer to the version of himself he was starting to envision, a version that was confident, capable, and unafraid of the future. But just as his focus deepened, a phone call came one afternoon that sent a ripple of fear through his entire body. His mother had been rushed to the hospital again. Her condition had worsened, and this time, Jason wasn't sure what to expect. He quickly left school and headed to the hospital, his heart heavy. But as he walked through the sterile, white hallways, he reminded himself of the promise he had made to his mom, "We'll figure it out, together." She had given him the strength to face his fears, and now, it was his turn to return that strength to her. When he arrived at her room, he found her resting in the bed, pale and fragile but still fighting. She smiled weakly when she saw him, and in that moment, Jason realized something important. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, even when things were hard. And no matter what happened, he would show up for her. "I'm here, Mom," Jason whispered, sitting beside her bed. "I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes fluttered open, and she smiled faintly, her hand reaching out to hold his. "I know, baby. I know." Jason sat in the hospital waiting room, his mind racing. His mom was still in surgery, and he had no idea what the outcome would be. The doctors had been vague, offering no guarantees, only the cold certainty of what they were dealing with. His heart felt heavy, a weight he could barely lift. But in the midst of his fear, one thing remained clear: he couldn't stop now. The phone in his pocket buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "Sarah, hey, just checking in. How's your mom? Let me know if you need anything, okay?" Jason stared at the message for a moment, the kindness in it settling over him like a warm blanket. He quickly typed a response. "Jason, she's in surgery. I'm just waiting. Thanks for checking in, though. Means a lot." He put the phone back in his pocket, trying to push the gnawing feeling of helplessness away. This wasn't the time to lose himself in anxiety. He had too much to focus on: his mom, school, the competition, and everything else in between. But in that moment, it felt like everything was being pulled in different directions, and he was caught in the middle, trying to hold it all together. It was nearly 2 hours later when a nurse finally came out to speak with him. The surgery had gone well, but his mom still wasn't awake. They needed to monitor her closely. Jason's stomach tightened at the thought of what might happen. He thanked the nurse and headed to her room, where he sat quietly by her side, trying to remain strong despite the overwhelming fear threatening to consume him. The next few days were a blur. His mom remained in the hospital, and Jason spent most of his time there, working on his homework between visits, trying to find a balance that never seemed to quite work. The weight of his responsibilities was growing, and every time he tried to focus on something other than his mom, guilt crept in. How could he think about anything else when she needed him so badly? But there was one thing that Jason hadn't expected: the math competition. It had seemed like such a distant goal, something far removed from everything that was happening in his life. But as the day of the competition drew closer, it became harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just a test, it was an opportunity. It was his chance to prove that he could step up, to show himself and the world that he could do something extraordinary. As much as Jason had wanted to pull out of the competition, his mom's words echoed in his mind: "We'll figure it out, together." She had always been there for him, and now, it was his turn to honor that. On the morning of the competition, Jason stood in front of the mirror, trying to steady his nerves. His mom was still in the hospital, her condition fragile, but she had encouraged him to go, telling him that no matter what happened, he should never stop chasing his dreams. For her, for himself, and for everything they had fought for together. The competition took place at a nearby university, and Jason walked into the large auditorium with a mix of nerves and anticipation. The room was buzzing with students from all over the region, many of them older and more experienced than him. Jason felt small in comparison, but he reminded himself why he was here. This wasn't about the others, it was about him, his abilities, and proving that he could do something he had always believed was within his reach. Mrs. Parker was there, of course, her encouraging smile in the crowd, and Jason felt an unexpected surge of confidence. He had been preparing for this moment, and now, it was time to see what he was truly capable of. As the competition began, Jason felt his mind shift into gear. The first few problems were challenging, but not impossible. His mind worked through the calculations with ease, his confidence growing with each question. For a moment, he was lost in the rhythm of solving equations, his world narrowing down to the numbers on the page. He was good at this, better than good. He was great. But then, as the clock ticked down and the problems became harder, Jason's thoughts began to wander. He couldn't shake the image of his mom lying in a hospital bed, the fear creeping back into his chest. Was she okay? Was she awake? Shouldn't he be with her right now? It was in that moment, with just minutes left on the clock, that Jason made a decision. He could finish this competition, he could prove to himself and everyone around him that he was capable of more than they ever expected. But it wasn't just about winning, it was about proving that he could rise above the circumstances, that he could push through the uncertainty, and come out stronger on the other side. Jason took a deep breath, focused, and continued working through the problems, one after another. The last few questions were a challenge, but he answered them with a calm determination, refusing to let the noise of his emotions derail him. As the time ran out, he sat back and exhaled, a feeling of quiet satisfaction washing over him. He had done his best, and that was all he could do. Later that afternoon, when the competition had ended and Jason was waiting for the results, he received a call from the hospital. His mom was awake. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed out of the auditorium to find a quiet place to speak with the nurse. "Jason," the nurse said, "your mom is stable now. She's awake and asking for you." A wave of relief flooded through Jason, and he quickly made his way back to the hospital. When he arrived at her room, he found her sitting up in bed, looking tired but alert. She smiled weakly when she saw him. "Hey, baby," she whispered. "I knew you'd make it through. I knew you'd do something great." Jason sat beside her, his heart full. "I didn't know if I could, but I did it. And I'm here now." His mom's eyes shimmered with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Jason. You're stronger than you know." The next day, the results of the competition were announced, and Jason's name was called. He had placed in the top 10, an achievement that seemed impossible just a few weeks ago. But as he stood there, accepting his recognition, it wasn't just the applause that mattered. It was the knowledge that he had pushed through the toughest of times and emerged victorious, not just in the competition, but in life. That evening, Jason sat with his mom, reflecting on everything that had happened. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice filled with pride. "I did," Jason said, smiling. "But I couldn't have done it without you." His mom squeezed his hand. "No, baby. You did it because you believed in yourself. You've always had it in you. Now the world will see it too." Jason realized in that moment that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. There would always be challenges, always be obstacles, but there would also be moments of triumph. And with his mom by his side, and the strength he had found in himself, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. The days following the math competition were a whirlwind of emotions. Jason had returned to his usual routine, but everything felt different now. The feeling of accomplishment from the competition lingered in his chest, but it was tempered with the reality of his mother's condition. She was still recovering, still fragile, and every phone call he received at school made his heart race with the fear that something would go wrong. But through it all, Jason felt a new sense of determination. He had proven something to himself, he had pushed through his fears and his doubts, and he had come out stronger for it. His mom was his anchor, his constant reminder that no matter the circumstances, he could overcome anything. And now, with her getting better, it was time for him to focus on his future. It was a Tuesday when Mrs. Parker asked Jason to stay after class again. Jason was surprised. He had assumed that after his recent performance in the competition, there wouldn't be much more to discuss. But there she was, waiting for him by her desk with that knowing smile on her face. "Jason," she began, "I've been thinking about your future. About your potential. And I know this might seem sudden, but I think you should consider applying for a full scholarship to a college. You have the kind of mind that shouldn't be confined to just this classroom. I know you're going through a lot right now, but this could be a huge opportunity." Jason felt a rush of emotions, excitement, fear, and confusion all at once. A scholarship? But I haven't even thought about college. I mean, with everything going on at home. Mrs. Parker held up her hand gently, her eyes serious. "I understand that it seems overwhelming. But this isn't just about school. It's about your future. You've got the talent, Jason. Don't let your circumstances define you. Let your abilities define you. You deserve a chance to go as far as you want to go." Jason was quiet for a moment, taking it all in. He had always known that college was a distant dream, something that felt too far away to grasp, especially with everything that had happened with his mom. But Mrs. Parker's words hit him harder than he expected. He had worked so hard to get to this point, and now, there was a possibility, a real chance, that he could make his dreams come true. But could he handle it? Could he handle leaving his mom to pursue something so big? "I don't know if I can do it," he said, his voice low. "I don't know if I can leave her alone." Mrs. Parker's expression softened. "Jason, it's not about leaving her. It's about giving yourself the opportunity to grow. You're not abandoning anyone. You're showing them that you're capable of achieving greatness. And that greatness will always come back to the people you love." Jason felt a lump form in his throat. It was true, his mom had always encouraged him to aim higher, to chase his dreams. But the idea of stepping away from her, even for a short time, felt almost impossible. He had been her caregiver for so long that the thought of leaving her behind was terrifying. "Just think about it, okay?" Mrs. Parker said, her tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to decide right now, but you owe it to yourself to at least explore the possibility." Jason nodded, though doubt still clouded his mind. It was a lot to take in. But somewhere deep down, he knew that this was the kind of decision he would need to make, sooner or later. His future was waiting for him, but it was up to him to step forward and claim it. The next few weeks were a blur of thoughts and emotions. Jason tried to balance his schoolwork, his mom's recovery, and the looming decision about his future. He found himself staying up late, studying for tests, while at the same time, researching scholarship opportunities. The more he learned, the more he realized just how much potential he had, how much he had to offer the world. It was overwhelming, and yet exhilarating. But the question still hung over him like a storm cloud: could he leave his mom? One evening, as he sat in his room, his phone buzzing with notifications, he received another message from Sarah. "Sarah, hey, Jason. You're gonna hate me, but I was thinking about something. I know you've got a lot on your plate, but what if you just went for it? What if you applied to a bunch of colleges, and you took a leap of faith? You're not alone, you know. You've got me, and you've got people who support you. You don't have to do everything on your own." Jason stared at the message, his heart tightening. It was exactly what he needed to hear. Sarah always seemed to know the right thing to say at the right time. He replied quickly. "Jason, I don't know, Sarah. It feels like too much right now. My mom still needs me. Sarah, and you'll be there for her. But you can't keep putting your dreams on hold. You can do both. And if you don't take that first step now, when will you?" Jason's finger hovered over the screen. Sarah was right, as always. It wasn't just about his mom, it was about him, too. He had dreams, ambitions, and they weren't going to wait forever. That night, Jason made a decision. He would apply for the scholarships. It wouldn't be easy, but he would find a way to make it work. The next day, he went to the hospital, as he had every day since the surgery. His mom was in better spirits now, but she still needed him. He sat by her side, just as he always did, and told her about his decision. "I've been thinking about something, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "I want to apply to college. I think I want to go. I've got a chance, and I think it's time to take it." His mom's eyes softened, a proud smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I always knew you had big dreams, Jason. You've got everything you need to make them happen. And no matter where you go, you'll always be my son. You'll always be home to me." Tears pricked at Jason's eyes as he reached for her hand. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his chest. This was the right decision. It was the hardest decision, but it was the right one. The following months passed in a blur of applications, essays, and long nights of studying. Jason worked tirelessly, pushing himself beyond what he thought he was capable of. And as he sent out his applications, he felt a sense of accomplishment that was greater than any test or competition. This was his future, unfolding right before his eyes. But even as he moved forward, there was something that kept pulling him back: his mom. She was still recovering, still fragile, and Jason knew that he couldn't leave her until she was strong enough. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he truly believed that he could do it. He could balance his dreams with his responsibilities. He could step forward and still hold on to the things that mattered most. Jason's journey wasn't just about proving something to the world. It was about proving something to himself. He was capable of greatness, but it wasn't the kind of greatness that came from escaping his past, it was the kind that came from confronting it, facing the challenges head-on, and never backing down. And in that moment, Jason knew that no matter what came next, he would always be ready to rise. Because he wasn't just living for himself anymore, he was living for everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. And with his mom by his side, he knew there was no limit to what he could achieve. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Mrs. Parker's voice echoed in his mind once more. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? For Jason, the answer was clear. It was love, resilience, and the belief that, no matter what, he would always rise to meet the future head-on. The phone call that Jason had been anxiously waiting for finally came on a Friday afternoon, just as the school bell rang, signaling the end of another long week. Jason had been checking his inbox obsessively, hoping for an update on his scholarship applications. The moment he saw the unfamiliar number flashing on his screen, his heart skipped a beat. Hello. Jason's voice was shaky, a combination of anticipation and nerves. Is this Jason Turner? A friendly voice asked on the other end. Yes, it is, Jason replied, sitting up straighter. His palms felt clammy. This is Dr. Lawrence from Brightwood University. I'm calling to inform you that we've reviewed your scholarship application and I'm thrilled to tell you that you've been accepted. You've earned a full academic scholarship to our school. Jason's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't process the words. Full scholarship? To a prestigious university? His mind reeled. It didn't seem real. Jason? Are you there? Dr. Lawrence's voice cut through his daze. Yes, I'm here, Jason said, still trying to wrap his mind around the news. I can't believe it. This is amazing. We were all impressed by your application and the story you've shared. Your dedication to your education and your resilience in the face of challenges made you stand out. We're excited to welcome you to Brightwood. Jason sat there for a few moments, stunned. A full scholarship. It was everything he had dreamed of. But as quickly as the excitement flooded his mind, doubt crept in. He was leaving behind everything he had known, his family, his home, his mom. Jason? Dr. Lawrence's voice broke through again. We understand this is a big step, and I'm sure you'll need some time to process. Take all the time you need, but we would love to have you here with us. Can I expect your decision soon? Jason didn't know what to say at first. He could feel the weight of his responsibilities pulling him back, the sense of obligation to be there for his mom. But this was his future. His chance to pursue everything he had worked for. I need to think about it, Jason finally said. But thank you. I'm honored. I'll let you know as soon as I can. Of course, take your time. And congratulations again, Jason. You've earned it. As the call ended, Jason put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, trying to gather his thoughts. The decision was suddenly so much bigger than he ever anticipated. That evening, Jason found himself back in his mom's room at the hospital. She had been getting stronger every day, and her spirits were high. She smiled when she saw him walk through the door, but there was something different about the way she looked at him. It was like she already knew. Mom, Jason began, his voice tentative. I've got some news. I was accepted to Brightwood University. They're offering me a full scholarship. His mom's eyes widened with surprise and joy. Jason, that's incredible. I knew you had it in you. I'm so proud of you. Jason smiled but couldn't help the knot that formed in his stomach. It's amazing, Mom. But I don't know if I can leave you. You're still recovering. I don't want to go if you still need me here. His mom's smile softened, and she reached out to take his hand. Jason, you're my everything. But you also have a life to live. A future to build. This scholarship is a gift, something you've worked so hard for. You can't let it slip away because of me. But Mom. Jason, she interrupted, squeezing his hand tightly. You've always been there for me. You've done more than anyone could ask. And now it's time for you to focus on yourself. This isn't just about leaving me behind, it's about you taking the next step in your life. I'll be okay. I promise. Jason's heart swelled with emotion. He had always known how much his mom believed in him, but hearing her say those words, seeing the confidence in her eyes, filled him with a sense of purpose. She was right. This was his chance. He couldn't let it pass him by. Okay, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I'll go. His mom's face lit up with pride. You're going to do amazing things, Jason. I believe in you with all my heart. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Jason spent every free moment packing and organizing everything for his departure. The thought of leaving was bittersweet. While he was excited to take the next step in his journey, the reality of leaving his mom behind was overwhelming. He visited her every day, knowing that this was one of the last times they would be in the same place together for a while. On the day of his departure, his mom hugged him tightly, her arms strong despite the weariness that lingered in her bones. You're ready for this, she whispered in his ear. Go. Be amazing. Show them who you are. Tears welled up in Jason's eyes as he pulled back and looked at her. I'll never stop thinking about you, Mom. I'll visit every chance I get. His mom smiled softly, her eyes brimming with pride. I know. And I'll always be here for you. You have everything you need inside of you. Just keep moving forward. The first few days at Brightwood University were a whirlwind. Jason was assigned a dorm room with a roommate named Ethan, a quiet but friendly student from across the state. He was also introduced to the campus, the professors, and the rigorous academic environment that awaited him. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The campus was beautiful, with sprawling green lawns, towering buildings, and a bustling student body. But Jason often found himself overwhelmed by the weight of everything. It wasn't long before he met some other students in his math class, and while they were all smart, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. They all seemed so much more confident, so much more experienced. They had lived in environments where academics came easily, and Jason felt like he was constantly playing catch-up. But then, during his second week, he was sitting in the student center when he overheard a conversation between two students discussing an advanced math theory that Jason had studied in high school. He had excelled in this topic back then, and something inside him clicked. Without thinking, Jason walked up to them and joined the conversation. Actually, he said, his voice steady, that's only partially correct. There's another approach you can use to solve that problem. The two students turned to look at him, surprised. Jason could feel the heat rise in his face, but he pushed through. Who are you? One of them asked, intrigued. I'm Jason, he replied. I'm in Professor Sullivan's class, too. The conversation shifted, and Jason found himself discussing the theory in depth. By the end of the conversation, the other students were looking at him with newfound respect. They weren't just surprised by his knowledge, they were impressed. As he walked away, Jason felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in a while. He wasn't just some student at a prestigious university, he was a student with something to offer. He was part of something bigger, and for the first time since he arrived, Jason realized that maybe he did belong here after all. As the days turned into weeks, Jason started to feel the weight of his decision more and more. His schedule at Brightwood University was rigorous, and the pressure of his academic load was much greater than anything he had ever experienced before. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed by the amount of work that seemed to pile up every day. It wasn't just the coursework. Jason found himself adjusting to an entirely new way of life. The students at Brightwood were brilliant. Many had come from prestigious schools, had attended special programs, and had already established academic reputations long before arriving. Jason felt like an imposter, like he didn't quite belong with them. His self-doubt crept in during late-night study sessions, when he'd overhear others discussing their previous accomplishments, and he'd compare them to his own life, which had been shaped by challenges rather than accolades. But despite the pressure, Jason found solace in one thing: the friendships he had begun to form. Ethan, his roommate, became a steady presence in his life. Ethan wasn't the typical college student either. He wasn't from a rich family and didn't have an Ivy League background. He was quiet, introspective, and loved studying obscure theories in physics. His presence grounded Jason during moments of doubt. They would spend hours late at night, sipping coffee, chatting about everything from their favorite books to their dreams for the future. Ethan was someone Jason could rely on, someone who understood what it was like to be out of place. Still, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was teetering on the edge of something he wasn't sure he could control. He felt the constant push and pull between his responsibilities at school and his promise to his mom. His mother had gotten stronger over the months, but she was still fragile, still recovering from the surgery that had turned their world upside down. Jason called her every night without fail, trying to stay connected even though he was hundreds of miles away. It wasn't long before his worries began to show. He had been losing sleep, and it started affecting his grades. One afternoon, as he sat in his dorm room trying to focus on an upcoming exam, he received an email notification from Professor Sullivan's office. "Dear Jason Turner, we hope this email finds you well. We wanted to notify you about your current academic standing in the advanced calculus class. We noticed that your recent grades have slipped, and we want to remind you that this is a critical course for your major. If you're struggling, we strongly suggest you come in for a meeting to discuss your progress. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Sincerely, Professor Sullivan's office." Jason stared at the screen, his heart sinking. This was the last thing he needed. He had worked so hard to get here, and now, with everything he was dealing with, he was on the verge of failing one of his core classes. Without thinking, Jason picked up his phone and dialed his mom's number. He needed to hear her voice, needed her reassurance, even though he knew there was nothing she could do from so far away. "Hey, Mom," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Jason, sweetheart, how's everything going?" His mom's voice came through the phone, warm and comforting as always. "I don't know, Mom. I've been struggling. I'm falling behind in class, and I feel like I'm losing control of everything. This scholarship, this opportunity, it feels like it's slipping away from me." There was a pause on the other end, and Jason could almost hear his mom thinking. "Jason, I know this is tough, but you've always risen to the occasion before. Remember when we didn't know how we'd make it through last year? When we didn't know if I'd even make it through surgery? You didn't give up then, and you're not going to give up now." Jason sighed. He didn't know how his mom could be so calm and confident in him when he felt so lost. "But this is different. This is college. Everyone here is so much smarter than me. I don't know if I can keep up. Jason, listen to me. I raised you to be strong, to never back down, no matter how hard things get. And you know what? You're not alone. You've got people there who care about you, including your professors. If you're struggling, ask for help. Don't be afraid to reach out. You've already shown them how capable you are, now show them that you're willing to fight for it." Jason closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that. I'm proud of you, Jason. Don't ever forget that." The next day, Jason walked into Professor Sullivan's office, feeling a knot in his stomach. The last thing he wanted was to admit that he was struggling, but he knew it was the only way forward. Professor Sullivan, an older man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, looked up from his desk when Jason entered. "Ah, Jason. Good to see you. Please, take a seat." Jason sat down, his nerves still high. "Professor Sullivan, I wanted to talk to you about my performance in the class. I've been struggling, and I know my grades have dropped recently. I don't know how to keep up with everything." Professor Sullivan leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful. "I see. Well, Jason, I can tell you that you have potential. But you're right. This class isn't easy, and it's clear that you're not giving yourself enough credit. I've seen how hard you've worked in the past, and I believe you can turn this around. But you're going to have to ask for help. You don't have to do this alone." Jason nodded. He had always been the type to keep things to himself, to handle his problems quietly, but this was different. "I'll try harder, Professor. I won't let this slip away." "That's the spirit," Professor Sullivan said with a smile. "I'll be here to support you, Jason. And remember, if you ever need extra help or just someone to talk to, my door is always open." As Jason left the office, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had a plan now. He would ask for help, he would fight for this opportunity, and he wouldn't let himself be defeated by the pressure. The following weeks were a mixture of highs and lows. Jason attended every study session he could find, met with Professor Sullivan for extra tutoring, and leaned on Ethan when the stress became too much. Slowly but surely, his grades began to improve. He could feel the momentum building, and it gave him the motivation to push through the toughest days. But despite the progress, Jason couldn't help but feel that the pressure was always there, looming over him like a storm. There were moments of doubt, times when the exhaustion felt unbearable. But he kept going, step by step, knowing that he couldn't afford to quit, not now, not after everything he had fought for. And all the while, his mom's words echoed in his mind, "You're not alone. You've got this." The campus had started to feel more like home to Jason, but it wasn't without its challenges. He had pushed through the worst of his academic struggles, gradually regaining confidence as his grades began to improve. Yet, the pressure never quite left him. Every exam, every assignment felt like a reminder of how much he had to prove, not just to the university but to himself. His heart often raced as deadlines approached, and some nights, he found himself staring at his textbooks long into the night, too tired to absorb the material but unable to stop. Despite the weight of it all, Jason couldn't deny the sense of accomplishment he felt when he received an email from Professor Sullivan congratulating him on his improvement. His hard work was paying off. He wasn't just staying afloat, he was excelling, and that felt like a victory in itself. But even with all his progress, Jason still had moments where his doubts resurfaced. During one of his late-night study sessions in the library, Ethan noticed the exhaustion on his face and decided to take matters into his own hands. "You know," Ethan said, glancing at the clock, "you've been at this for hours. How about we take a break? There's a game night tonight in the student union. Everyone's going, and I think you could use a little fun." Jason rubbed his eyes. He'd been so wrapped up in his studies that the thought of having fun seemed foreign to him. "I don't know. I still have a ton of work to do." "Jason," Ethan said, giving him a stern look, "you can't keep running on empty. You need to recharge, or you're going to burn out. Trust me, I've seen it happen before." Jason hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but Ethan was right. The constant cycle of studying and worrying was wearing him down, and he needed to take a step back. "All right," Jason said, finally giving in. Let's go. But only for an hour. The student union was alive with energy when they arrived. Laughter echoed through the halls, and the room was filled with clusters of students chatting and playing games. Jason hadn't realized how much he missed the simple joy of being around people. He had become so focused on his studies that he had isolated himself from everyone, even Ethan at times. But now, seeing the carefree atmosphere, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. Ethan led Jason to a table where a group of students were gathered, playing a friendly card game. As they sat down, the energy of the group was infectious. Jason was quickly drawn into the game, laughing and joking with his new friends, forgetting for a while about the piles of homework waiting for him. He realized just how much he had been missing out on by not giving himself time to relax. As the evening wore on, Jason found himself feeling lighter, like he was finally breathing again. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of balance, something he hadn't realized he needed so badly. When they finally left the student union that night, Jason couldn't help but feel grateful to Ethan for dragging him out of his study hole. "Thanks, man," he said, as they walked back to their dorm room. "Anytime," Ethan replied with a grin. "Just don't make it a habit. We need you at your best, not running on fumes." Jason smiled, his spirits lifted. Maybe balance wasn't just about academics, it was about life too. The next morning, Jason woke up with a newfound sense of purpose. He attacked his studies with a renewed energy, but this time, he made sure to take breaks when he needed them. He realized that he didn't have to be perfect, he just had to give his best. That mindset helped him face his classes with a clearer head, and it showed in his results. His professors began to notice, and Jason's confidence grew with every passing week. But just when it seemed like everything was falling into place, life threw him a curveball. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when Jason received a phone call that shook him to his core. He had just returned to his dorm after a long day of classes when his phone buzzed with an incoming call from his mom's hospital. His heart dropped into his stomach. "Hello," he answered quickly, his voice tight with worry. "Is this Jason Turner?" a calm voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Jason. What's going on? Is my mom okay?" His words rushed out in a flurry, panic creeping into his voice. There was a long pause. "We're calling to inform you that your mother's condition has worsened. We've been trying to reach you, and we think you should come to the hospital as soon as possible." Jason's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What's happening to her?" The voice on the phone seemed careful, almost hesitant. "It's difficult to explain over the phone, but we need you here immediately. She needs you." Jason's mind raced as he processed the information. His mom had been doing so well, at least according to the last few phone calls. He couldn't understand how things could have changed so suddenly. His first instinct was to drop everything and head straight to the hospital, but he knew that wasn't realistic. He had to think this through. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking, "I'm on my way." The drive to the hospital was a blur. Jason's thoughts were scattered, his heart pounding with every passing mile. The moment he arrived, he rushed to the receptionist's desk, desperate for information. "Where is she? Where's my mom?" he asked, barely able to contain his anxiety. The receptionist looked up, her face softening with sympathy. "Room 303. She's in critical care." Jason didn't wait for another word. He ran down the corridor, his footsteps echoing off the sterile walls. When he reached his mom's room, he stopped in the doorway, his heart aching at the sight before him. His mom lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and still. Tubes and wires were attached to her body, and the rhythmic beeping of the machines filled the room. Jason's stomach twisted in fear. His mom's doctor was standing at her side, looking up as Jason entered. "I'm glad you made it here quickly," the doctor said. "Your mother's condition has taken a turn for the worse. Her body is struggling to recover, and we're doing everything we can to keep her stable." Jason's throat tightened as he stepped forward, taking his mom's hand gently. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, and her eyes fluttered open. She smiled faintly, her voice weak but steady. "Jason. I knew you'd come." Tears welled up in Jason's eyes as he tried to control the overwhelming emotions. He didn't know how to deal with this. He had always been strong for her, but now he felt as though he was crumbling under the weight of it all. "You've been so strong, Mom," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." She squeezed his hand. "You've already proven that you're capable of more than you know. Don't ever doubt yourself, Jason. You've come so far. Keep going." Jason looked at her, feeling like he was on the edge of losing everything. He didn't know how he was going to handle this, how he was going to keep going without her. But in that moment, with her hand in his, he felt the weight of her words. She had always been there for him, and now, it was his turn to be strong for her. Jason's days at the hospital were long and heavy. His mother's condition remained precarious, and the doctors did their best to keep her stable. There were moments of hope when her vitals seemed to improve, but there were also setbacks, days when her body seemed too weak to fight. Jason spent his time in the hospital room, refusing to leave her side, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. He felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on him. How could he manage everything, the college workload, the pressure to succeed, and now, the need to be present for his mom? It felt like his life had been divided into two worlds, one of academic ambition, where he fought for a future, and the other of love and duty, where he fought to keep the woman who had given him everything alive. The sleepless nights started to take their toll. Jason found himself struggling to focus on his assignments, his concentration fractured by worry. He knew his professors could see his decline. His once thriving academic performance had started to slip again, but this time, it wasn't just exhaustion. It was fear, the fear of losing the person who had shaped his entire existence. Yet, despite all the chaos, there were moments of clarity. During his late-night study sessions at the hospital, when the world outside seemed quiet and still, Jason found himself reflecting on the lessons his mother had taught him over the years. Her words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the strength that had always been there within him. "Remember, Jason," she had told him so many times, "you don't have to be perfect. Just keep trying. The effort matters." And try he did. A week after Jason had rushed back to the hospital, things started to shift. His mother's condition stabilized enough for the doctors to feel cautiously optimistic. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for her to recover and for Jason to find his footing again. Jason had missed a significant amount of class time, but as his mom's condition improved, he felt the pressure to catch up. His professors had been understanding, but he knew that they wouldn't wait forever. Time was running out. One afternoon, after spending the entire morning with his mother, Jason made his way to the campus library. He had promised himself that he wouldn't let this opportunity slip away. Even if his world felt out of control, he would still fight for his future. Ethan had been a constant presence during this time, checking in on him regularly. He had even helped Jason with his assignments when Jason could barely keep his eyes open. "You've got this, man," Ethan would say, his calm demeanor grounding Jason when his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. That day in the library, Jason found a quiet corner and spread his textbooks in front of him. He felt like a mountain had to be climbed, there was so much to do, but he had learned that every climb, no matter how steep, started with one step. And so, he began. Slowly but surely, he made progress. He focused on one subject at a time, letting the quiet around him absorb his attention. It wasn't easy. Each page felt like an obstacle, each equation a reminder of how much he still had to learn. But as he sat there, surrounded by the hum of the library and the words in his textbooks, Jason began to find a rhythm. His mind, once clouded with worry, started to clear. He was doing the thing his mom had always taught him to do, he was pushing forward, even when it felt impossible. A few days later, Jason received another email from Professor Sullivan. It was a short message, but it sent a wave of relief through him. Dear Jason, I wanted to personally reach out and commend you on the improvement I've seen in your recent assignments. I know the last few weeks have been difficult, and I'm proud of your efforts. Keep up the good work. I have no doubt you'll finish strong. Best regards. Professor Sullivan. Jason stared at the email for a moment. It wasn't just the praise he had wanted, it was the validation that his hard work was being recognized. He had faced one of the hardest challenges of his life, and somehow, he was making it through. For the first time in weeks, Jason allowed himself to smile. There was still so much to do, but he was no longer drowning in the pressure. He had learned something invaluable over the last few weeks, that strength didn't always come from doing everything perfectly. Sometimes, it came from simply refusing to give up. Jason's journey wasn't just about academic success, it was about resilience and balance. Over the next few weeks, he learned to lean on his friends and professors when things got tough. Ethan continued to support him, and even though they both had their own challenges, their friendship grew stronger. Together, they navigated the ups and downs of college life, supporting each other in ways that went beyond academics. At the hospital, Jason's mom slowly regained her strength, and with each passing day, the doctors were more confident in her recovery. She still had a long road ahead, but the worst was behind them. Jason visited her every chance he could, always telling her about his progress in school, and she listened, her face softening with pride. "You're doing it, Jason," she said one afternoon, her voice still weak but filled with warmth. "I knew you could. You're stronger than you know." It had been months since Jason's life had been turned upside down. His mother, once so fragile and ill, was now in the process of recovery, and though her path was slow, it was steady. Jason found himself at a crossroads in both his personal life and academic journey. The pressure of balancing school, hospital visits, and maintaining his own mental health had been grueling, but he was slowly learning to adapt. As the final exams for the semester approached, Jason realized just how much he'd changed. His grades were now back on track, and he had managed to catch up on all his assignments, even earning a few compliments from his professors along the way. But despite his academic success, the nagging feeling of inadequacy still lingered. Deep down, Jason felt like he hadn't yet proven everything he needed to prove. The turning point came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, just days before his final exams. Jason was studying in the library, as he always did, when Ethan dropped by with a serious look on his face. Jason looked up from his textbook, surprised to see his friend looking so somber. "Hey, man," Ethan said, taking a seat next to him. "Got a minute?" Jason closed his book, sensing that something was off. "What's up?" Ethan took a deep breath before speaking. "I know things have been tough for you, especially with everything going on with your mom. But, Jason, you've been living like you're trying to survive, not thrive. You're capable of so much more than just getting by. It's time you start believing that." Jason frowned, unsure of what Ethan meant. "What are you saying?" "I'm just trying to get through this semester. I'm not trying to do anything more than that." Ethan gave him a pointed look. "You've been working hard, sure. But there's a difference between working hard and working smart. And I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit. You've got the potential, Jason. I see it in you." Jason felt a mix of confusion and frustration. He didn't know if he was ready to hear it. "I'm just trying to keep my head above water," he replied quietly, almost to himself. Ethan didn't back down. "You're more than just someone trying to stay afloat. I've watched you grow, through all of this. Your mom, the pressure, the struggle. And you're still here, standing tall. Don't let fear hold you back from reaching your full potential." Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of how to process his friend's words. He had been so focused on the struggle, so focused on the next hurdle, that he hadn't really stopped to consider what it meant to actually thrive. The conversation with Ethan stuck with Jason for days. He couldn't shake the idea that he was simply getting by in life rather than truly embracing the possibilities that awaited him. His mother's recovery had brought some relief, but he was still carrying around the weight of everything: his grades, his responsibilities, and the need to prove to everyone that he was capable. He spent the next few days reflecting. When he wasn't studying for finals, he was at the hospital, supporting his mom. She was still in recovery, but she had regained her strength, and Jason could see the light returning to her eyes. Her encouragement fueled him. "I'm so proud of you, Jason," she would say, her voice steady now. "You've always been a fighter. Don't forget that." And then, one afternoon, it hit him. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It wasn't about managing his life in a way that simply kept things from falling apart. He could do more than that. He had always been smart, he just never realized how much his potential could really stretch. For the first time, Jason truly believed in his own capabilities. He spent the next few days preparing for his finals, not with fear or hesitation, but with purpose. It was no longer about just getting through it. It was about mastering it. He was done doubting himself. Jason embraced his intellect, his resilience, and his ability to rise above challenges. The morning of his last final exam, Jason woke up early, his mind sharp and focused. He took a deep breath as he looked out the window of his dorm room. The rain had stopped, and the sun was peeking through the clouds. It felt symbolic, like the world was clearing up along with his own mind. He was no longer that kid who was just trying to get through life. He was someone who could take on whatever came his way, and he was ready to prove it. The final exam went smoothly, as Jason felt the confidence he'd gained over the past months manifest itself in his work. Each question seemed like something he was prepared for, and he answered them with clarity and precision. For the first time in months, Jason actually felt calm during an exam. It was as though he had finally discovered the key to his own success: believing in himself. When he finished the exam, he turned in his paper and walked out of the room with a sense of accomplishment. He wasn't just relieved that it was over, he was proud of the way he had handled everything. He had faced the storm and come out stronger. Later that evening, Jason sat with Ethan and a few other friends in the campus cafe, celebrating the end of exams. The atmosphere was relaxed, and the tension that had filled Jason's life for months was finally starting to dissipate. Ethan noticed the change in his friend right away. "How do you feel, man?" Jason grinned, the weight of the past few months lifting off his shoulders. "I feel like I'm ready to take on the world." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That's a pretty big statement." Jason chuckled. "I know. But it's true. I spent so much time just trying to survive, trying to get by. But now, I'm realizing that I can do more than just that. I can thrive, I can excel, and I can make the most of this life. I don't need to doubt myself anymore." Ethan smiled, proud of his friend. "That's exactly the Jason I've been waiting to see." As the weeks went by, Jason's transformation was clear to everyone around him. His grades came in, and they were better than he had ever hoped for. But it wasn't just about the grades. It was about the way he carried himself, the way he approached challenges, and the way he had learned to believe in his own abilities. His mother's recovery continued to improve, and Jason made it a point to be by her side, showing her the same love and strength she had always shown him. Together, they celebrated each victory, no matter how small. Jason knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be obstacles, but he had learned to see them not as roadblocks but as opportunities to grow. With the support of his friends, his family, and his own belief in himself, he knew that there was nothing he couldn't accomplish. And in the back of his mind, the words his mom had spoken to him so many times still echoed, "You're stronger than you know." Jason finally understood what that meant. Strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up every time you did. The semester had officially ended, and Jason stood on the threshold of what felt like an entirely new chapter in his life. The grueling weeks of studying, hospital visits, and the relentless pressure to succeed had come to an end. As the summer sun warmed the campus, Jason found himself in a quiet moment of reflection, finally allowing himself to breathe. He walked around the campus, letting the familiar paths that had once seemed so daunting become more comforting. The echoes of the late-night study sessions, the rush of deadlines, and the constant worry about his mother's health were still fresh, but they didn't weigh him down as much as they had before. He felt lighter, not just physically, but emotionally. He had earned this moment of peace. As Jason made his way across the quad, he saw Ethan sitting under a large oak tree, his textbooks scattered around him. Ethan waved him over, a casual smile on his face. "Hey, man. How's it feel to be free?" Ethan asked, tossing a pen between his fingers. Jason took a seat next to him, resting against the tree's trunk. "It feels surreal. I can't believe it's over. I honestly didn't think I'd make it through the semester, especially with everything going on with my mom." Ethan nodded. "I get that. But you did, man. You showed everyone around you what you're really capable of. You didn't just survive, you thrived." Jason looked at his friend, grateful for his support. "I don't know how I did it. Some days, I barely knew which way was up." "You did it because you chose to keep going," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "And that's what makes all the difference." Jason smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude toward his friend. They had both come so far. Ethan had always been there for him, but Jason had finally learned to be there for himself. It was a revelation, one that came not just from overcoming obstacles but from realizing that his worth didn't depend on how much he had to endure. The weeks following the end of the semester were a time of rest and renewal. Jason spent more time with his mom, who was now strong enough to go out for walks, enjoying the simple things in life that had once been taken for granted. They laughed, they talked, and most importantly, they appreciated each moment together. Jason knew how fragile life could be, and he didn't want to waste any more time stressing over things that weren't important. Despite the sense of peace that had settled over him, Jason knew there was still more he had to do. He had always been driven, always felt the pull to be something greater than himself. But now, he understood that he could pursue his goals with a sense of purpose and balance, without sacrificing his well-being or the relationships that meant the most to him. One afternoon, as Jason and his mom sat on the porch, she turned to him, her face glowing with pride. "You've come so far, Jason," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "You've made it through the hardest part, and I couldn't be prouder of you. But remember, life isn't just about surviving. It's about living fully. You have the ability to do incredible things. Don't let anything hold you back." Her words settled in Jason's heart, and he realized that they were more than just a reminder, they were a call to action. He had the ability to achieve greatness, but only if he allowed himself to pursue it with the same passion and love that had always been his foundation. As the summer months stretched on, Jason began to explore new opportunities. He had been invited to attend several networking events, thanks to his impressive academic recovery. He found himself meeting more professors, students, and professionals who encouraged him to consider a future in areas that had once seemed out of reach. It was thrilling, yet daunting. Jason had never truly envisioned himself in the kind of positions these people spoke about, but as they talked, something inside of him clicked. His IQ had never been the thing that defined him, but now he could see how his intellect could open doors for him in ways that had previously felt impossible. The world was suddenly much bigger than the campus he'd spent so much time within. Jason realized he wasn't confined to a set path, he had the freedom to carve out his own future. One afternoon, while attending a guest lecture on entrepreneurship, Jason met Dr. Rebecca Hill, a renowned figure in the business world who had come to speak about the challenges and rewards of being an entrepreneur. Jason was captivated by her words, her insight into the world of startups, and her passion for creating change. After the lecture, he approached her, feeling an unfamiliar sense of excitement. "Dr. Hill, your lecture was incredible," Jason said, nervously adjusting his glasses. "I've always been interested in business, but I never thought I'd have the skills to succeed in that world." Dr. Hill smiled, her expression kind yet sharp. "You'd be surprised. The most successful entrepreneurs aren't always the ones who have the most experience. They're the ones who are willing to learn, to take risks, and to think outside the box." Jason hesitated before asking, "Do you think someone like me, someone who's just starting to figure things out, could make it in the business world?" She studied him for a moment, then said, "I think you've got what it takes. But it's not just about what you know. It's about how you apply it. You have the drive. That's half the battle." Her words stuck with him, and for the first time, Jason felt a spark of excitement for the future. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of taking it. Over the next few weeks, Jason dove into exploring the world of business. He attended workshops, read books, and reached out to people who could help guide him. His time in the hospital, his struggles, and his eventual triumphs had given him a unique perspective on life. He didn't want to just be another successful student or graduate. He wanted to make an impact, to use the lessons he'd learned to help others, to create something meaningful that would endure. It wasn't an easy journey, but Jason felt ready for it. He was no longer the kid who was just getting by. He was the kid who had learned how to navigate life's toughest challenges and come out stronger on the other side. Now, he was determined to build something that would leave a lasting legacy. As the summer came to a close, Jason found himself standing at the edge of a new beginning. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to take that first step. He had proven to himself that he could rise above the challenges life threw at him. And now, with new horizons before him, Jason was ready to make his mark on the world. The summer had passed in a whirlwind of new experiences and personal growth. Jason had spent his days meeting new people, reading books that challenged his thinking, and taking small, yet significant, steps toward shaping his future. As the fall semester approached, he realized just how far he had come. The journey that had once been filled with uncertainty and fear had gradually transformed into one of anticipation and excitement. But, as with all great journeys, Jason knew that the true test was just beginning. He had a choice to make, a choice that would determine whether he would continue to coast along or finally take a bold leap toward his dreams. It all started with an email he received one Tuesday afternoon. Subject: Invitation to apply for internship at Momentum Tech. Jason. We are pleased to inform you that after reviewing your academic record and recent achievements, you have been selected as a potential candidate for an internship at Momentum Tech, one of the leading companies in tech innovation. Our team was particularly impressed with your academic performance and your resilience in overcoming personal challenges this past year. We believe that you have the potential to make a meaningful impact on our team. If you are interested, please submit your application by the end of this week. Looking forward to hearing from you soon. Best regards. Samantha Ford, HR Coordinator, Momentum Tech. Jason stared at the email for what felt like an eternity. Momentum Tech was a cutting-edge technology firm known for its work in artificial intelligence, robotics, and digital solutions. It was exactly the type of company he had dreamed of working for, but it also felt like a leap into the unknown. He had been considering applying for jobs in business or even starting his own venture, but an internship at a tech company was a huge commitment. He had no prior experience in the field, and though he had developed an interest in technology, he wasn't sure if he had the skills to contribute meaningfully to such a prestigious organization. But as he reread the email, a small spark of excitement flickered inside him. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, an opportunity to push himself out of his comfort zone, to challenge his limits, and to step into a new world. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and hit reply. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Jason spent countless hours working on his resume, crafting a cover letter that balanced his academic achievements with the personal growth he had experienced over the past year. He wanted to make sure that the company saw him as more than just a student with potential. He wanted them to understand that he was a driven, resilient individual who was ready to make a real impact. The deadline loomed closer, and as Jason sat in the library one evening, he felt a familiar sense of doubt creeping in. Was he really ready for this? Could he compete with the other applicants, some of whom had far more experience than he did? His mind raced with all the reasons he could back out, but then he remembered something his mom had told him during one of their quiet conversations. "Jason," she had said, her eyes filled with conviction, "you've always been afraid of taking risks. But remember, nothing great ever happens unless you're willing to take that first leap. The fall might be hard, but the view from the top will be worth it." Jason thought about her words as he sat at his desk. He had already overcome so much, his fears, his struggles, the uncertainty that had once defined his life. This was just another hurdle, one that could open doors he never thought possible. With that thought, Jason hit send on his application. A few days later, Jason received an email that would change the course of his life. Subject: Interview Invitation, Momentum Tech. Jason. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected for an interview for the internship position at Momentum Tech. The interview will be held virtually on Thursday at 3 p.m. Please be prepared to discuss your background, academic experiences, and your interest in technology. Looking forward to speaking with you. Best regards. Samantha Ford, HR Coordinator, Momentum Tech. Jason couldn't believe it. He had made it past the first hurdle. The interview was now a reality, and he felt a rush of adrenaline surge through him. But with that excitement came nerves. What if he wasn't prepared enough? What if he didn't know the answers to the questions they would ask? Ethan, who had been his rock throughout the entire journey, was the first person Jason turned to. They met at their favorite cafe, a cozy little spot near campus. "You did it, man. You actually got the interview," Ethan exclaimed, his face lighting up with pride. Jason nodded, his nerves palpable. "Yeah, but now comes the hard part. The interview. What if I screw it up?" Ethan smiled, his tone reassuring. "Jason, you've been through worse. You're more than ready for this. Just be yourself. They want to see who you are, not just your qualifications. You've already shown them that you're capable. Just let them see the real you." Jason exhaled deeply, trying to steady his racing heart. "Thanks, man. I don't know what I'd do without you." Ethan clapped him on the back. "You do just fine. You've got this." Thursday arrived, and Jason was a bundle of nerves. He set up his laptop and adjusted the camera so that everything looked perfect for his virtual interview. As the time drew closer, he felt his anxiety building, but he kept reminding himself of everything he had learned during the past year. This wasn't just about the interview, it was about the person he had become, the lessons he had learned, and the strength he had discovered within himself. The screen flickered, and a woman's face appeared. It was Samantha Ford, the HR coordinator he had been corresponding with. "Hello, Jason. It's so nice to finally meet you," she said warmly. Jason smiled, doing his best to keep his composure. "Nice to meet you too, Ms. Ford." The interview began, and as the conversation flowed, Jason felt the nerves begin to fade. The questions were challenging, but he answered each one with confidence, drawing from his academic experiences, personal growth, and the new skills he had developed over the summer. By the time the interview was over, Jason felt a sense of accomplishment, no matter what the outcome was. He had given it his all. That evening, as he sat in his dorm room, Jason's phone buzzed with an email notification. Subject: Internship Offer, Momentum Tech. Jason. We are excited to extend an offer to you for the internship position at Momentum Tech. Your interview demonstrated the drive, determination, and intellect we are looking for in our team members. We are confident you will make a positive impact on our company, and we look forward to welcoming you aboard. Please review the attached offer letter and let us know your decision by the end of the week. Congratulations. Best regards. Samantha Ford, HR Coordinator, Momentum Tech. Jason sat in his dorm room, staring at the email with a mix of disbelief and excitement. The offer from Momentum Tech wasn't just a job, it was the opportunity he had dreamed about for so long. He had worked so hard to get to this point, and now it was real. The first real step in his professional journey was in front of him. But even as the excitement bubbled up inside him, a voice of doubt whispered in the back of his mind. Could he handle it? Could he keep up with the expectations of a top-tier company like Momentum Tech? Sure, he had proven himself at school, but this was a whole new level. He would be surrounded by brilliant people, experts in the field. What if they saw through him? What if they realized he wasn't really as capable as they thought? Before his anxiety could spiral, his phone buzzed. It was his mom. Jason smiled, his heart warming. No matter how big his world had gotten, she was still the one he turned to for reassurance. "Hey, Mom." Jason answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hey, Jason. I just saw the email, and I can't believe it. You did it, honey." Her voice was filled with pride and love, as always. Jason laughed, a little nervous. "Yeah, I guess I did. It's crazy, Mom. But now I'm kind of scared. I don't want to mess up." His mom's tone softened. "You've been scared before, Jason. Remember last year? When you thought you'd never make it through? Look where you are now. You've already proven you can handle more than you think. Just take it one step at a time. You don't have to have it all figured out right now." Her words were like a balm to his restless thoughts. "You're right. Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." After their conversation, Jason felt a sense of calm wash over him. He wasn't alone in this, and no matter how big the challenge seemed, he had already faced some of the hardest things life had thrown at him. He could handle this. The next day, Jason made his decision. He accepted the internship offer from Momentum Tech. The weeks leading up to his first day were a blur of preparation. Jason had to move quickly, getting his documents in order, researching the company's history and culture, and brushing up on tech concepts he wasn't entirely familiar with. He had learned a lot over the past year, but this was a whole new ball game. He needed to show that he could bring value, even if he wasn't an expert in the field yet. Jason also reached out to some of the professors he had become close with during his time at university. They had seen his academic journey firsthand, from his early struggles to his triumphs, and they had always encouraged him to push further. "Jason, I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. But you're walking into a very competitive environment. Don't let that intimidate you," Professor Carter had said during one of their meetings. "If you're ever feeling unsure, remember that the only way to grow is by taking risks and challenging yourself. That's what will set you apart." As his first day at Momentum Tech approached, Jason was filled with a mix of excitement and nerves. He knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the one that could launch his career. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the fear that he might not be good enough. The first day at Momentum Tech arrived, and Jason found himself standing outside the glass and steel building that housed the company's headquarters. His palms were sweaty, his heart raced, and his thoughts kept returning to all the reasons he might not belong. But then he took a deep breath, remembering his mom's words. One step at a time. He walked into the building, his steps echoing through the sleek lobby. The receptionist greeted him with a warm smile, and she guided him to the conference room where the orientation for new interns was being held. As he entered, he noticed several other students, all of them looking equally as nervous. They were from prestigious universities, some already with experience in tech-related fields. For a moment, Jason felt like an imposter. These students seemed like they belonged here in a way he didn't. They spoke confidently about their past internships and projects, while Jason had nothing to show except his grades and a fierce desire to prove himself. He tried to stay focused and not let his doubts take over. Samantha Ford, the HR coordinator, introduced herself to the group. "Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you all here at Momentum Tech. You are among the brightest minds in your generation, and we are looking forward to seeing what you bring to the table." Jason nodded, trying to keep his face neutral, but inside, his stomach churned. The day passed in a whirlwind of introductions, company tours, and briefings about ongoing projects. Jason was introduced to his mentor, a senior developer named Claire, who was sharp, no-nonsense, and incredibly knowledgeable. She gave Jason a brief overview of the tech stack they were using and the kind of projects he would be working on. "You're going to be diving into some challenging projects, Jason," Claire said, looking him up and down. "I'll be here to guide you, but I expect you to take initiative. This isn't a place for passengers." Jason swallowed his nervousness. "I won't disappoint you." Claire nodded curtly and handed him his first task, to review a project proposal for a new AI initiative they were working on. The team had already done the heavy lifting, but Claire wanted Jason to get a feel for the technical jargon and the problem-solving aspects of the project. It wasn't an easy task, but it was a starting point. Jason spent the next few hours working through the proposal, his mind racing with new concepts and unfamiliar terminology. He didn't feel entirely confident, but he was determined to give it his best shot. After all, that was why he was here, to learn, to grow, and to prove that he belonged. As the day came to a close, Jason sat at his desk, staring at the work he had done. It wasn't perfect. But it was a start. And that, he realized, was all he needed. The days that followed were a blur of deadlines, meetings, and learning new technologies. Jason was pushed to his limits in ways he had never been before. Some days, he felt like he was treading water, trying desperately to keep up with the pace of the projects and the expectations of his mentors. But over time, something clicked. As he began to understand the concepts, as he started to contribute to the team's projects, he felt more confident in his ability to make a difference. He wasn't just an intern anymore. He was someone who brought value to the table, someone who was slowly but surely earning his place among the talented people at Momentum Tech. And as the weeks passed, Jason realized something even more important: this was just the beginning. His internship was the first of many challenges, but it was also the foundation for something much bigger. The world had opened up for him, and he was ready to take on whatever came next. The weeks at Momentum Tech continued to fly by. What started as overwhelming uncertainty began to transform into something more familiar: confidence. Jason could feel himself growing with each passing day, not only as an intern but as an individual. Each project he worked on felt like a small victory, a tangible step toward the professional life he had always dreamed of. His initial doubts about being surrounded by experts slowly dissolved as he realized that every single person at the company, no matter how seasoned, had once been in his shoes. They had all faced their own doubts, their own moments of fear. Jason's mentor, Claire, continued to challenge him, pushing him to solve increasingly difficult problems. At first, Jason had struggled to keep up, but now, he found himself rising to the challenge. He had spent hours poring over code, attending late-night study sessions with other interns, and asking countless questions. And with each answer, he grew more competent, more capable. There were still tough days, though, days when the weight of the work felt overwhelming. But Jason's mindset had shifted. He no longer saw the challenges as insurmountable obstacles. Instead, he viewed them as opportunities for growth, moments where he could prove not just to his team but to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever believed. One particular afternoon, Jason was sitting at his desk, focused on a particularly tricky segment of code that was causing issues in one of the AI projects. The algorithm wasn't functioning as expected, and he couldn't figure out why. He had tried everything he could think of, but nothing seemed to work. Frustration gnawed at him, and the familiar feeling of self-doubt crept back. Just as he was about to abandon the task for the day, Claire stopped by his desk. "How's it going?" she asked, her eyes scanning his screen. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I can't figure it out. I've been working on this all day, and the algorithm still isn't behaving." Claire sat down next to him and looked over the code. She didn't rush to offer solutions. Instead, she asked probing questions, encouraging Jason to think critically about his approach. "Have you tried isolating the issue to see where the bug might be? Sometimes, it's easier to spot the problem when you break it down into smaller parts." Jason looked at the code with new eyes. He had been so focused on fixing the whole thing at once that he hadn't thought about breaking it into manageable pieces. Slowly, he started to dissect the problem, isolating each part of the algorithm. As he worked through the issue, the solution became clear, and within minutes, he had solved the problem. Jason sat back in his chair, his heart racing with a sense of accomplishment. Claire smiled, a proud but understated look in her eyes. "Good work, Jason. Sometimes, the hardest part is just stepping back and thinking it through calmly." Jason nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he truly felt like he belonged at Momentum Tech. He had overcome the doubt, the fear, and the frustration. He had risen above them. In the following weeks, Jason continued to shine. His confidence grew, not just in his technical skills but in his ability to work collaboratively with others. He had learned how to ask the right questions, how to communicate his ideas clearly, and how to listen when others shared their expertise. One afternoon, as he was wrapping up his work for the day, Claire approached him again. This time, there was a different look in her eyes, a mixture of pride and something else, something that hinted at an important conversation. "Jason," she began, "I've been really impressed with your work over the past few weeks. You've taken on some challenging tasks, and you've done well with them. But I want to talk to you about something. You've proven that you have the skills and the drive to succeed in this industry. But what I see in you is more than just a competent intern. You have leadership potential." Jason blinked, momentarily stunned. "Me? Leadership?" Claire smiled. "Yes, you. You've got the ability to think critically, solve problems, and communicate effectively. Those are the traits of a leader. I'd like to offer you a chance to take on a larger project next month, something that will push you even further and give you more responsibility. Are you interested?" Jason's mind raced. Leadership? He had never considered himself as someone who could lead. But as he thought about everything he had accomplished so far, he realized that maybe, just maybe, Claire was right. Perhaps he had more to offer than he had ever believed. "I'm definitely interested," Jason said, his voice steady. "I'm ready for the challenge." As the days turned into weeks, Jason's role at Momentum Tech continued to evolve. He had successfully completed several high-level tasks, and now, he was entrusted with overseeing an important part of the next project. He was given the task of coordinating a small team of interns, managing their progress, and ensuring that deadlines were met. At first, the thought of managing a team made Jason nervous. He didn't want to mess up or let anyone down. But as he settled into the role, he realized that leadership didn't mean knowing all the answers, it meant being able to bring out the best in others, to support and guide them as they tackled challenges together. Jason found himself thriving in this new role. He discovered that he had a natural ability to listen to his teammates, to offer guidance when needed, and to build trust within the group. His confidence soared as he saw the impact his leadership had on the team's success. One Friday afternoon, Jason and his team were in the final stages of a major presentation for one of Momentum Tech's clients. The pressure was on, and the team had been working tirelessly to ensure everything was perfect. Jason could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but he was ready. The presentation went off without a hitch. The clients were impressed, and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. As the team filed out of the conference room, Claire caught up with Jason. "You did it," she said with a smile. "This is your first big win as a leader. I'm proud of you." Jason smiled back, a sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. This was more than just a project, it was proof that he was ready for anything. He had come so far from the nervous, unsure intern who had walked into Momentum Tech months ago. As Jason left the office that evening, he took a moment to reflect on how much he had grown. He had faced his fears, pushed past his doubts, and taken on challenges that once seemed impossible. And now, he was no longer the underestimated intern. He was someone who had proven not just to his colleagues but to himself that he was capable of achieving greatness. And this was just the beginning. Jason's heart pounded as he stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie one last time. Today was not just another day at Momentum Tech, it was the culmination of everything he had worked for. The final presentation for the client that would mark the conclusion of the project he had led from start to finish. The entire team had worked hard, and now it was time to show the world what they had accomplished. Jason took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but it wasn't the pressure that was overwhelming him anymore. It was the realization that he had come so far in such a short amount of time. From the nervous intern who had walked into the Momentum Tech offices months ago, unsure of himself and filled with doubt, to a leader entrusted with overseeing a high-profile project. The months had been a whirlwind, full of sleepless nights, tough challenges, moments of doubt, and plenty of growth. But through it all, Jason had learned more about himself than he ever thought possible. He wasn't just a good problem solver or a diligent worker anymore. He had developed the skills and mindset of a true leader. As Jason walked into the conference room, he felt a surge of excitement mixed with a touch of nervousness. His team was already there, gathered around a large table, their laptops open and their focus sharp. Claire was standing by the window, watching as Jason entered. "Ready?" she asked, her voice steady but warm. Jason nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." The client arrived soon after, a group of well-dressed executives from one of Momentum Tech's biggest partners. They shook hands with Jason and the rest of the team, settling into their seats as the presentation began. Jason took his place at the front, standing tall and confident. This was his moment to prove that not only had he learned from the best but that he was capable of contributing something valuable to the company. His voice was steady as he guided the clients through the presentation, explaining the intricacies of the project, how the technology they had developed would revolutionize their operations, and what kind of impact it would have in the long term. Jason's team members presented their individual pieces of the project, but Jason was the one who had woven everything together, ensuring that all the components fit seamlessly into the bigger picture. When the final slide was revealed, showing the successful implementation of the technology and the expected outcomes, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then, the client executives exchanged impressed glances before one of them, a middle-aged man with graying hair, leaned forward. "This is exactly what we were hoping for," he said, his voice filled with approval. "Your team has done outstanding work. We're excited to move forward with this." Jason felt a surge of pride in his chest. The team had done it. They had succeeded, and now their hard work was being recognized. As the meeting came to a close, Claire gave him an encouraging nod, her expression one of quiet pride. Later that evening, as Jason sat alone in his apartment, reflecting on the day, he felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Not just because the presentation had gone well or because the client was impressed. It was because, for the first time in his life, he truly believed that he was capable of achieving whatever he set his mind to. As he scrolled through his phone, Jason noticed a message from his mom. His heart warmed as he opened it. "Jason, I'm so proud of you. I always knew you were capable of great things. Keep pushing yourself. You've already come so far." Jason smiled to himself, feeling a swell of gratitude. His mom had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Her support had been the foundation that had allowed him to reach for the stars. Just then, his phone buzzed again. It was an email from Momentum Tech's senior management team. He opened it eagerly, his curiosity piqued. The email began with praise for his leadership on the project, congratulating him for his contributions and the success of the presentation. But then came the part that caught Jason's attention. We are pleased to offer you a full-time position at Momentum Tech after the completion of your internship. Your leadership, problem-solving abilities, and commitment to excellence have made a significant impact on our team, and we are excited to see what you can achieve moving forward. Jason's heart raced. It wasn't just the recognition he had received from the clients or his colleagues. It was the validation that he had made it. He had earned his place. The next day, Jason walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't even officially accepted the offer yet, but he already felt like he had found his home. The work was challenging, the people were inspiring, and the possibilities were endless. As he sat at his desk, reviewing the next steps in his current project, Claire approached him once again. This time, there was no task to give him or problem to solve. She simply stood there, looking at him with a smile. "You did it, Jason," Claire said, her voice filled with pride. "You've shown what you're made of. You've proven yourself as a leader, and now you've earned the chance to continue growing with us." Jason nodded, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "I couldn't have done it without you, Claire. You pushed me when I needed it, and you believed in me when I didn't." Claire gave him a rare, approving nod. "You did the hard work, Jason. Now, it's up to you to keep pushing yourself to new heights. Remember, this is just the beginning. You're capable of so much more." As Jason sat there, reflecting on Claire's words, he realized that she was right. This was just the beginning. There would be new challenges, new opportunities, and new lessons to learn. But he was ready. He was no longer the underdog. He was no longer the underestimated intern who had stumbled into this world unsure of his place. He had proven that he was capable of achieving greatness. And the best part? He knew it wasn't just luck, it was the result of his hard work, his determination, and his refusal to let fear hold him back. As Jason looked around the office, he saw his colleagues working hard, solving complex problems, and pushing the boundaries of technology. He knew that he had found his calling, and there was no limit to what he could achieve in the future. This was only the beginning of his journey, and he was ready to see just how far he could go. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?